by the fire catching up. Looking good, wish I could tell you I was over us. But I get high every night when I'm all alone, 'cause it helps me forget that I'm feeling low. Told you I was doing fine, it's a lie, you should know. And if you want the truth, I'm still in love with you. No matter what, I'm still in love with you.
Tell myself I don't care who you're with, I'm losing my mind. Picture you making love to someone else. Tell me why. To shut up all these memories, but I wake up and they come running back to me. So have your fun giving up, I guess you won and I messed up. And I'm acting a fool, I'm still in love with you. No matter what I do, I'm still in love with you. Oh, tell me you want me to, and if you want the truth, I'm still with you, and it's killing me.
endlessly.
'Cause I'm bound to be somebody who's helplessly and desperately still in love with you. I am still in love. Oh, tell me that you want me to. You want me to, and if you want the truth,
Summer nights, drinking wine by the fire, catching up.
Our doors opened in 1874 with a simple goal: to educate students. But there's always been more to it than that. When the world battled its neighbors, Mcallister raised the United Nations flag. When others said no, Mcallister said yes. When division and discrimination plagued this country, Mcallister alumni and students organized and took action.
We are not complacent.
We are not apathetic.
You, out there, have made a difference. In your neighborhood, in your town, in your city, and beyond. So, for all the learners, for all the mentors, for all of us everywhere asking big questions, thank you.
Thank you for not just asking why, but also what's next. Thank you for launching our mission into the world. Thank you for continuing to support that mission. Every day, for every student whose aim is to lift up, to change, to discover, to reimagine.
To make this a place where we all belong.
A place where education is just the beginning.
It is our practice to begin our programs with the Land Acknowledgement.
We would like to take a moment to honor the fact that Mcallister is on Dakota land, and many of us currently occupy the ancestral homelands of the Native peoples who were forcibly exiled from the land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. We make this acknowledgement to honor the peoples of the First Nations, their ancestors and descendants, as well as the land itself. We recognize that this acknowledgement itself is not enough and only serves as a first step towards decolonization.
Hello, and welcome to this evening's Big Question program. I'm Celeste Prince, class of 2010, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm also a high school English teacher, and right now you are in my classroom. This is where I've been, like so many other K through 12 workers, in my dining room, now turned my home office and classroom. So I personally, I'm very excited and curious about this conversation. Before we begin, I would like to share a few technical details with all y'all. Have no fear. If you have any questions or technical difficulties, you can chat Mac Help staff directly from the platform, or using your mobile phone, text the phone number 651-204-3910 for assistance to contact our tech support team directly. We have allocated plenty of time this evening, both for questions you might have shared during registration, as well as live questions you may submit this evening using the Q&A box. I will be sharing who is asking the question, so if you could share your name and pronunciation with your question, I would appreciate it. In addition, we will move to another Zoom Remo after the program for continued conversation. We hope you'll join us there. Watch the chat for the link. Wrestling with big questions often leads to those breakthrough Mcallister moments, connecting people with one another, to faculty, and to the work of the college. This year, we're thrilled to have Mcallister President Suzanne Rivera leading the Big Questions conversations. As we continue to welcome her to Mcallister, we appreciate her leadership, especially now as we navigate everything happening in the world around us. She's excited to continue to meet alumni and parents around the globe online until we can connect in person again. Tonight, we discuss the big question: will the pandemic make K-12 more equitable? This year, we have seen our educational system go through many changes, and each district having to determine how to respond. Education is said to be the great equalizer, but variance in opportunities and resources often thwart even outcomes. When it comes to equity, has COVID-19 exacerbated persistent disparities, or might this be the first step for true educational transformation? These are critical and difficult issues. We're fortunate that President Rivera will bring her bioethicist lens to the discussion as our host tonight. Joining her in the conversation are Mcallister's Dr. Lesley Lavery, Associate Professor of Political Science, and Dr. Brian Lozenski, Associate Professor of Urban and Multicultural Education. This will surely be a great conversation. President Rivera, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Celeste. We're so glad you could be with us tonight. Before we do anything else, I want to acknowledge that February is Black History Month. Of course, we need to think about racial justice at all times, but this is a month during which we take a more focused opportunity to reflect on and celebrate the many contributions Black people make on our campus, in our community, and across the world. I want to add my own words of welcome to Celeste's. It's so great to be with all of you today, whether you're dialing in from St. Paul or from somewhere else far away. I'm really looking forward to my conversation with Professors Lavery and Lozenski, and I hope some of you will engage with us too during the Q&A portion of the evening. So let's dig into tonight's conversation. We all know the importance of education generally, and especially the effects on people's lives that their K-12 experiences have. We don't know what the impact will be on today's students who are learning during a global pandemic. But tonight we explore our speakers' perspectives on this important topic. How is the pandemic affecting the education of our young people? So Professor Lozenski, I'm going to start with you.
Great.
The topic of today's event is, will the pandemic make K-12 education more equitable? It's a provocative question. I want to begin with a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about the concept of equitable education. What does equity even mean in this context?
Yeah, and thank you so much again, Dr. Rivera. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. I mean, the question that you're posing is an incredibly large question, and but it's actually fundamental to the nature of the educational projects that we engage in. And so, there's been theorizations of education on one side of the spectrum that think about schooling and education as a form of social reproduction that inherently contains the inequities that are part of the broader society and reproduces them to continue them in perpetuity. And then there's the other side of education that's has a liberatory bent to it, and thinking about schooling and other educational projects, both formal and non-formal, that are about changing the world and positioning people to ask deep questions. And I think a lot of that we hope lies in our liberal arts tradition here. And so thinking about inequity. Part of my work as educational historian, specifically coming through the lens of a Black and African American tradition, it's really important first to understand that education is inherently political. It's a political site. So everything from demographics, who gets access to resources, how educational resources are distributed, who gets to teach, what are the qualifications to determine that, thinking about curriculum, what gets taught, why it gets taught, for what purposes, thinking about governance, funding structures. All of these things are political decisions that get made on a daily basis from macro level, state level, district level, and even federal policy, all the way down to every single teacher's minute-to-minute decisions that they're making. And so inequity can exist in all of those arrangements. And so for me, I'm thinking about this particular moment. And I know Lesley is going to have quite a lot to say, I think, about her current moment. But I want to historicize this moment a little bit and think about since the inception of mass tax-funded education coming about, and of course in the United States there's been forms of public education, forms of tax-funded education that have come even before the country was a country. Mm-hmm. But when we think about kind of like our current structure, we can look back to kind of the turn of the 20th century, and so starting at that point, I would argue that there's been kind of like three major shifts, and we're actually in the midst of the third one. The first one I would actually point to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which in 1954 changed the structural demographics of education nationally. And Brown v. Board was an attempt at kind of like making educational resources more equitable and getting rid of the Jim Crow structures of racial segregation in education. With Brown v. Board, that desegregation process lasted, well over 25 years from the 1950s all the way through the late 1970s, and in a lot of ways has still not been reconciled today, right? And so we think about the way that Brown v. Board tried to address inequity of access and the distribution of resources. And then we might fast forward to another major shift, which I would argue is kind of in the No Child Left Behind era of and the standardization movement coming out of the late 1990s into the 2000s, and the impact that had on the mechanisms of schooling, and particularly around surveillance of learning, and the collection of data. And so thinking about that also as a mark of trying to make things more equitable in terms of student outcomes, and knowing that we had large disparities in terms of race and class in particular, but also language and geography. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And then we get to today, where COVID, I think, marks what I would say is the largest shift we've had in terms of delivery mechanisms, where we've gone from completely, almost 100% in person, almost 100% virtual in lots of ways, right? But that's done in a few months, mm-hmm. right? Whereas these other large changes happen over large periods of time. And I'll end by saying both Brown v. Board and No Child Left Behind, even though they were, the inception was out of a push towards equity, we see that in a lot of cases, a lot of inequity happened as a result of those. So for instance, with Brown v. Board, you had the largest mass firing of Black educators particularly throughout the South. And then with No Child Left Behind, and the emphasis on standardized testing, you had the narrowing of the curriculum, scripted curricula, and again, this was, people were subject to varying forms of education depending on, again, geographies, parental income, all of those kind of things. So I'll stop there because I think, I hope that we would be able to have that hindsight as we're moving forward, kind of post this third major shift.
Well, that's a really helpful foundation for us to spring off of. So now I'm going to kick it to you, Professor Lavery. When you think about that term, the word equity or the term equitable education in today's context, and we're not just talking about teachers and students either, we're talking about a whole bunch of different structures. How would you define equity in that context?
I like to think of a book that I was introduced to in my undergraduate education called The American Dream in the Public Schools by Jennifer Hochschild and Stephen Skowronek. And in that book, they argue that education can serve multiple constituencies and multiple purposes. And so I think we've had those purposes in tension throughout all of these eras that Brian's talking about. Is it for each individual child? Is it for groups of children that may share certain characteristics? Or is the purpose of education for the collective good? And I think we often lose sight of that collective good as we make these changes. And it's hard to come to what is the collective good when you do have so much diversity and so much variation. And when it does seem like if one individual gains, another is going to lose. And that's what's always at tension when we talk about equity. And so the way I'm hearing it now, I've been interviewing teachers union leaders in 12 states in urban, rural, and suburban districts since the pandemic began about how are unions responding to the pandemic just as one of those structures or one of those interests in these debates. And I hear a lot that equity is being sort of used as a weapon. It's weaponized as a term, like we need to reopen schools because Black and brown children are left behind. It's about equity. Or no, we need to keep schools closed because Black and brown children are going to die disproportionately if we open them. And so you have both sides trying to capture what we are sort of agreeing on, but it's a lot easier to agree on on a big goal like that. That ambiguity is actually a tool in politics than it is on what that term means. And so this same thing with No Child Left Behind. As I always say when I teach this in class, no one wants to leave the children behind. We're going to come together on that. And so now we're coming together on everyone is recognizing in this moment there's a lot of inequality and inequity. Okay, but we don't agree on what to do about it or who has to give what or if there can be gains for everyone in reimagining some of these systems.
Yeah, well, you put your finger right on something that I want to make sure we talk about tonight, and that's this current debate during the pandemic about whether we should be figuring out ways to get students back into the classroom as quickly as possible, or whether we should be keeping them home. And as you note, Professor Lavery, people on both sides of the debate are making claims about how one decision or another might affect brown and Black communities. And I'll note here that many of the pundits and scholars making those claims are not of those communities, so raises really important questions about, who's opining here. It's also not clear that these arguments are always about student well-being per se. They might be about things like the economic well-being of a community, so parents can get back to their jobs, for example. So how do you think, I'm going to kick it back to you now, how do you think these decisions should be made about whether to reopen schools in advance of us having widespread access to vaccination?
So I think that we're left to pick up pieces because of a vacuum in federal leadership. And I think the leadership keeps being kicked down, so the federal government doesn't respond. Governors are left to respond. And many governors, including the governor here in Minnesota, said, okay, I'm going to leave it to districts to respond. I'm going to give you some broad categories, but districts, you choose. And then districts even are now kicking it down to individual schools and saying, okay, here's the general guidelines, but you figure out how this works for your school. And folks want that type of opportunity in normal times. They want to figure out what works for their school, and they're not given that opportunity. But now in a crisis, suddenly, yeah, you can take all the blame. You can take all the opportunity. So I don't think there is an equitable way, and I don't think there is a right answer because because things are so varied, and that has to do with school governance, disparities in resources, and the way that COVID has hit different communities. But this is problematic because then it leaves every individual to themselves to decide, and every family is deciding then, because districts have to continue to offer virtual learning as well. So every family then has to wrestle with this decision and these tensions, which I think threatens to further individualize this entire education agenda, and I think that's really concerning for public schools moving forward.
Yeah, well, often when we debate topics about which reasonable people can disagree, it's clear that there's not a single right answer, but there might be some obviously wrong answers. Yeah. So, Professor Lozenski, if you were to be asked, what would be some wrong ways to approach the question of whether to reopen schools or keep students home? What jumps to mind?
Well, I think one major one is, and there's this kind of like push to return to normal, right? And I think that has been, in and of itself, because of the histories that I laid out and the inequalities that we've been discussing, problematic.
Normal didn't work so well for everyone.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Because yes, normal in and of itself contains the inequities. And so, so that right there would be, construed as I'd say like a wrong answer to this. And so part of, I think, what we have in front of us is a really, we could look at it as quite an opportunity to take a step back, to really look at and address, things like, whether it's the kind of labor justice that, that Professor Lavery has been looking at, or whether we're talking about curricular justice, because it's not a matter of just bodies back in the classroom. It's also, again, takes us back to these debates of what is the purpose? What are we actually who are we trying to produce? What are the metrics that we're using to say that this person is an educated person, a learned person? And I'm thinking about, for instance, the insurrection at the Capitol, and I don't know if we want to head in those direction or not, but thinking about the kinds of education that produces ideologies of supremacy, right? Ideologies of wanting to have social hierarchies and class distinctions, and how those get mapped onto, how those get mapped onto our racial pasts and all those kind of, and our class distinctions, gender and sexuality, all of the ways we've invented to like beat up on each other, right? And so I do think we have quite a moment in front of us to confront, almost like have a moratorium in some way to say, okay, what can we actually do collectively, and I mean, now we kind of get back to the issue of like, what's the collective, right? Who gets to make those determinations? And so, I think those are the battles that confront us today. And I'm kind of, in Lesley's boat, is that I don't have any answers, particularly. I have the answers that I would like from my own communities and, the constituencies that I'm connected to and work with. We do have these discussions in our own ways, but to then say we're going to like make that the determinant, I think that becomes tougher.
Yeah, for sure. And as you note, not only can education be used to replicate ideologies that perhaps the three of us and many in the audience would think of as problematic or counterproductive, but education also presents possibilities for fostering a more communitarian ethos, and maybe it is sort of the moment right now to think about what is important for the good of the whole. And that makes me think about the ways in which we expect schools to meet needs other than the classroom education of our children, right? So many schools, even before the pandemic, were struggling to meet social and emotional needs of students. We often view schools as a repository for social programs, nutrition programs, all sorts of other programs other than classroom teaching. Why do we treat all of these things as the responsibility of schools? And is this a moment to ask ourselves that question? When I watch on the news school buses delivering food to kids who are not showing up for class, they're just showing up for food, should this moment, this pandemic opportunity, present a chance for us to rethink whether schools are the logical place to house or to address all of the other needs our children have?
Yeah, I think we can see it as an opportunity to either lean into that and really double down and commit to wraparound services, which is what some schools were providing pre-pandemic, or we can say, now we can see each piece distinctly, and that schools are doing all these things that need not necessarily happen through schools. And so if you want them to happen through schools, you have to give the adequate resources, and you have to have communication across agencies and constituencies that need to be providing these services. And so I was actually thinking while Brian was talking about what should we not do right now with reopening schools? And I think the wrong way to go about it is to disregard any stakeholders. And there are many stakeholders in these reopening debates. And so when you villainize or disregard any one of those parties, whether it be a certain group of parents or whether it's teachers or whether it's the government, then you're missing an opportunity to do something that we all have to do together and that works best in many different ways when all the parties can come together and actually feel like their interests are being served and they're being heard. I think one of the biggest mistakes that districts of all kinds and all governance structures are making is not communicating some of these nuances to families. So why do teachers not want to go back? Well, they don't feel safe. And they don't feel safe, maybe not because they don't have vaccinations, but also because they look at the CDC guidelines and they look at their classroom and they don't align. And if parents really thought about it, I know a lot of parents I talked to right when my kids were going to go back to school were like, well, yeah, of course they have to follow social distancing and masking, and they're going to do all these things. But then you think about 30 kids in the same classroom that they left before, and they will not be following social distancing. And so teachers are worried about that, and they're sounding the alarm. And parents may not even realize it until their kids go back to school. And so we need to have honest conversations about what's actually happening in our schools. I think parents also have seen more what happens in schools. It's different when a teacher's teaching online. I don't want my students' parents from Mcallister to think that what I do in my Zoom classroom is what I would do were we in person. But we do see some of the difficult work that teachers have to do and the conversations they have and all those many things that are on their plate. So it's exposed all of that. And I think the best way forward is to be honest about all the stakeholders and what stake they have in this process.
Yeah, and I'll just add, educational researchers, Cantor and Lowe, have this concept of educationalizing the welfare state, right? And that we've, kind of taken the social safety net that should exist, right, and then put it all in schools, right? And so again, like the kind of the points that you were making, President Rivera, right? So we're feeding kids. We need to make sure schools need to make sure they take care of their mental health. They need to take care of their physical health. They need to take care of social and emotional, right? And we see these movements, right, in terms of schools needing to emphasize, and so it brings up a contradiction because school then becomes the one-stop shop for every single need of a child and often their families, which again is putting too much pressure on one site to be able to do all of these things, because, right? And so again, I completely agree that there needs to be coordination across agencies, and at the same time, we can't ignore that learning is mediated literally by children cannot learn, or there's deterrence when they're hungry, when they're physically have anxiety and afraid and have psychological impediments, right, and all these kind of things. And so thinking about creating schools as the most humanizing environments possible, and addressing the psychological damage that also can come through curriculum, right? And so this is why we can't take a technicized approach to education as just about bits of learning and bits of knowledge. And I actually think we do a disservice to ourselves. Schools do a disservice through it's a hubris, right? It's the idea that we can measure any child's aptitude and intelligence and potential at any given time in any way, like as though we can take into account all of these factors. And I think part of the problem is that when we get so focused on metrics of achievement and attainment, we then put ourselves in a position where we cannot address all of the other, social factors that mediate learning. And so this is part of that idea of not going back to normal, because you can't do it all. You cannot psychologically, physically, nourish a child in one single space and then also measure them to a particular kind of standard that is about flattening the variables that impact that child's life to then position them for a role in society, that's already structured into a hierarchy. And that's, schools provide that rationalization for, okay, where you then belong in hierarchy. And that's the social reproduction, theory of like how these things play out. And so, yeah, so it's there's a lot that needs to change.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I feel so conflicted about this personally. I was a free lunch kid, and I know that those meals were really important for my family. But then I also can look at this and ask, does making schools give out lunches mean that it takes the pressure off the question of why so many families are living in poverty and need to have their kids fed for free at school or reduced lunch or whatever? And so does piling all of these things onto the education system actually create a sort of escape valve by which other kinds of structural change are allowed to not happen, or inequalities are allowed to persist because we expect the schools to provide a sort of a Band-Aid to other problems that we need to solve?
If we do that, but then also disinvest in schools, it becomes even more problematic.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I know neither of you has a crystal ball, but I'm going to ask, if you had to imagine, what do you think the generational effects of the pandemic will be on today's young people, today's K through 12 students? How do you think in 10 or 20 years we're going to look back and see what kind of effect this period had on their education and their outlook?
So I think because we have K through 12, it's a big span, and there's going to be differences on different ends of that spectrum. I think that we're going to see the students, if they make it through the anxiety and depression that are compounding, the students at the upper end of that spectrum are going to have a different perspective on education and on the urgency of problems like pandemic, like climate change, like school shootings, and there's going to be a fire set for them to really work towards changing these systems that they see. I think if you're a little kid, you don't see the systems. And the danger there, I don't think that everyone needs to be at certain standards at the same time in every grade. But I do think that there is a danger that there are kids that aren't learning to read that might be pushed through a standardized system if we go back to normal, that really will have gaps in their learning, and there can be real consequences for their education and for their future prospects.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that we are going. I think young people are getting really sophisticated at naming things that previous generations have not been able to name, particularly around mental health, particularly around structural inequalities at an earlier and earlier age. And I think, again, schools will do themselves a detriment to not make these questions central to to the educational project. And so I keep going back to the insurrection, but I saw two sides of that. I saw where teachers were taking up what was happening in real time and grappling with the really difficult questions of to what extent, right, does the U.S. represent democratic values, and I saw the other side of things where people educators were being forbidden to address what was happening in the right, and so. Again, we might see that chasm as depending on how educators and administrators and parents are willing to take up the very real questions that confront young people. And again, this is not a new debate. This is an old debate around the purposes of education, but this idea that school is about setting you up for the future, right, versus school is about the here and the now, and the more we can focus on the here and the now, I think that would be what serves us. The more we kind of like push and say, well, just do this now so you'll be prepared for the future, I think it's going to become more and more disaffecting for more and more students.
Well, if we focus on the here and now, then that takes a little pressure off these artificial guideposts that currently exist in our education system. I know a lot of people right now are worried about the idea that kids are going to fall behind, that this year is going to make them fall behind. So my question for you, and I'll kick it right back to you, Professor Lozenski, is why can't we just move the finish line? Is there something magical about progressing a certain amount in a time period?
Yeah, no, we totally can move the finish line, and again, this is not an argument for just saying like, okay, it's okay if kids don't learn how to read. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, if we're trying to readjust the purpose of what we're trying to do in our schools, then we have to adjust the metrics, right? And so adjusting the metrics then, I think will pull us back from this kind of really rigid space of saying, okay, if you don't know how to do these particular things, these skill sets in this particular way, right? And again, we're thinking about, and it's not just, and this is not just about, an arbitrary set of standards, right? This has to do with who young people are, right? And so, thinking about our multilingual students, right, who are often come in multilingual, some often with more language resources than their teachers, and then leave monolingual, right? Whereas kids coming in monolingual leave multilingual, right? We have this, very like asymmetrical experience that the most marginalized, tend to get the worst treatment. And so, to your question, yes, I mean, I think we can change the metrics. We can change how we measure and say, like, and figure out who and what we want young people to be. And for me, it's about what kind of questions are they asking, right? Instead of, we're so focused on can they answer a particular, canned set of answers, right? And this is what we look, I think this is what we look for in Mcallister students. I think, can they ask more difficult questions and
big
the more
questions,
you learn,
yes.
Big questions, right? The more engaged you are in these processes, right? The more complex your questions should be getting. And so for me, it's about those kinds of metrics rather than kind of a narrow reading this many words in this particular language or this particular grammar structure by this age and all those kind of things.
I think it depends on the purpose of standards, though, and what you think that is, because we don't have national standards right now. We have the Common Core state standards have been signed on to by the majority of states, and it was a political process to get states to sign on to those standards. So I think we can't expect not to go through more politics to get any standards to change. And I know you're involved in changing social studies standards, and that's a whole different debate. We've never even pushed that onto the national scene because it's so contentious. Well, in the 90s, there was a brief effort that shut us down from then even pursuing English and math standards. I think if we think of standards as goals and aims, then it's not necessarily problematic if they don't change. Like if we still think that by the end of high school, students should be able to do something in math, then we may have to adjust the scaffolding to get there. And I think when you adjust scaffolding, that often means changing the resources that you use, but that we may or may not then have to adjust the standards ultimately. I think that's maybe true of something like math, maybe not true of something like social studies, which is an ongoing conversation community by community anyway, because of the way that we've set this up.
So some differences in outcomes are clearly shaped by social inequality, social determinants, what zip code you're born into, what language your family speaks at home, stuff like that. But some of it has to do with individual differences among children, some who need more help to learn and some who need to be challenged more. How do you account for those kinds of individual differences or layer those individual needs on top of this larger question about structural equity?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I think part of this is, again, thinking about this balance, right? And this is the balance of a democratic question, right? This idea of collectivism versus individual liberty, right? And so these balances are very fundamental to an educational process. But I mean, personally, I don't think we're asking young people to like really ponder that balance, right? I think if they're lucky enough to make it through and then go to college, then they're probably getting the chance to ask those profound questions. But thinking about, for instance, a child coming in. Maybe they're coming in from a low-income situation. Maybe they're coming in, from again being multilingual, right? And how does that child experience an educational structure, right? School's often the first time a young person's removed from their family environment, right? And we know that there's a lot of predictability in terms of how young people lives will pan out, right? And we can always point to, of course, like individuals that make it through, right? But if we're not starting with that child, right? If we're not starting with that child at the center of and I'm saying the most marginalized child, right, at the very center of this, and wrapping our educational paradigms around that particular child, then we're just going to continue to perpetuate the inequalities by asking people to meet standards that, and I mean, the response to the standards question is we can have these, definitely like aspirational standards, and we can argue about the standards. We can argue about the social constructions of mathematics and social studies. I'd actually argue in mathematics, we don't ask young people to think like mathematicians very often. And so, and I think those arguments can be had, but too often I think we're just taking for granted, that what we've had in place is like fundamentally working.
Sort of a path dependence. We just keep doing what we're doing because that's what we've always done.
And a lot of the argument is that it is working. It is working to create the kind of social hierarchies that we see, and we continue down that pathway for very malicious reasons. Yeah.
I hate to do this, but as is the case with each of these big question events, we want to leave time for engagement with our audience. So I'm going to first thank you, Professor Lavery and Professor Lozenski, for bringing your perspectives to the conversation. And we're now going to move to the Q&A portion of the event for the next 20 minutes or so. So we've been tracking questions as they've been coming in, and you're all invited to continue to add questions using the Q&A tab. So we're going to now welcome back Celeste Prince, class of 2010, to moderate the Q&A portion of the evening. And as Celeste mentioned in her introduction tonight, she's an English teacher, so she's living this work every day, and I hope she also will bring her perspectives into the conversation. So Celeste, are you ready?
Oh yeah, let's go.
Okay.
There are so many questions, and it's really difficult to choose. So if we don't get to your question, y'all, please meet us in the networking event afterwards so we can continue this conversation. Okay, great. So first question I'm throwing out to you all is from Adon Martinez, class of 2016, he, him pronouns. You all were ending the conversation just now talking about the student, keeping the student in mind. And he asks, what effects, if any, does online learning have on the social development and relationship building of K through 12 students? How has the pandemic exacerbated those effects? And do we have reason to worry as a community? I know at my school right now, we're talking a lot about social and emotional, and that's consistently at the top of the list of priorities. So I think this is a great question to start us off.
Yeah, I think that's at the top of the list of priorities, and yet it's difficult to measure. And I think it goes all the way up to college too. I mean, this is what I'm thinking about most as an instructor in my Zoom room and my college students, but I also see it, my daughter is in first grade, and they have just, the school counselor rolled out a program where they circle the emoji faces that they feel each day so that an adult in the building can track that, which is, is a little surveillance state-like, but it's also an effort to get at some of those things that you maybe can't see through a screen as easily, and to put it at a level that kids can understand. The research isn't coming out on this as it relates to schools. It's coming out in general, like adolescent mental health. We're hearing a lot about that. But the research, there's always a delay in these sorts of things. I think it's very problematic right now, and that's one of the greatest reasons to return to normal, and I buy that much more than I buy the concept of learning loss or that we're going to miss out on standards, but I don't think we know yet the full magnitude of the consequences of what we're doing right now.
I would just add that there's so many factors that mediate a learning environment, and one of the messages we've heard is that the more technology solves things, right? Where we know that teaching and learning, it's a relational process, and so I actually do get concerned about and I think quality teaching can happen across lots of different mediums, right? And so if we've got an educator who's able to engage a young person in a deep kind of question, right, that's motivating, right? I think that can happen in all kinds of different spaces. And so I think there's lots of really high quality teachers who were doing that before, doing it in person and are doing it virtually. But I really do get worried about the technicization of education that is just about, knowledge transfer. Right, and again, I'm seeing, even my own children's, and I think they have some great teachers. I'm trying to call their teachers out, but but you do see like a Zoom screen with everyone's camera turned off, and I'm just sitting there like, that's, and and you see a lot of lecture, and you see a lot, and I'm just like, to me, it's not a motivating environment for the teacher either, to just be staring at a bunch of black squares on their key. I would, I'm hard pressed to say that we're doing like really high quality education in that way. And yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, as a teacher who teaches to those black squares, if anyone's listening, please tell your child to take their camera. I want to see their face. Talking about engagement actually leads to this next question. So that's a great segue. So this is from Jamie Cornell, class of 1982, he, him pronouns. It seems that the toughest issue, or at least one of the toughest issues, is keeping reluctant learners engaged using only an electronic communication medium. Thoughts on how to address this?
Well, I think if you make your classroom communities smaller and empower your teachers, then they have more energy to do this. And so if you're a kindergarten teacher with 30 students, it's going to be hard to find your least involved student and track them down. And I know teachers that go above and beyond to do this. And they're calling every family every night and finding extra time to meet with those extra students. And I'm also really worried that our teachers are getting burnt out. I know we're all burnt out. We're all done with the pandemic. But I do think that teachers burning out is a separate kind of issue because we can't just replace teachers tomorrow. There's no one lining up to take their jobs. So I think we have to be really aware of that and put some resources into making sure that kids can get individualized attention, which means that teachers also have some more support.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just, again, this is where educational theory is so important, right? And thinking about theories of cultural relevance. So right, making students' lived experiences central in the classroom. And so whether that's virtually or in person, that should not change, right? Like if young people are coming in feeling as though they're valued and that what they know is important in the classroom space, that's a motivating factor right there. And then adding onto that, thinking about the idea of dexterity and knowledge dexterity, can they take their language practices, their dance practices, all the aesthetics that they're into and make that into a learning and, put that into the learning environment? I think that's another really important piece. And then finally, this issue, I think, of social political consciousness and justice raising. I think these are the deep questions that young people are asking about the world. They're anxious, right? They're a lot, in some cases, scared. I think to be able to address that with providing aspects of hopefulness that look at times even when young people have created lots of change in the world. And so I think that happens a lot of times through inquiry-based education, having them ask particular questions that they're central to, and then building skills around those kinds of questions where they get to actually ask a question and then say, and then it's a kind of a flipped idea, right? Like if we can motivate them, the motivation becomes inherent in wanting to answer the question. So how do I do this? How do I gain the skill so I can answer this question in the way I want to be able to answer it? I think there's lots of strategies around being able to do that.
Excellent. You all mentioned teacher burnout, and I'm overdue for a vacation, I'll tell you that for sure. And so this question is from Becca Griffin, class of 2019, she, her pronouns. We went from teachers are superheroes in March 2020, to be fair, to teachers need to get in the classroom now in the fall. What might it take to see a cultural change surrounding the perception of American education? I remember in March, the first time everyone was locked in the house with the kids, Shonda Rhimes tweeted like, teachers should be paid $1 million a day. And I took that to heart. And so when, August came around and suddenly everyone was yelling, I don't understand where that energy from March went. So what do you all think might take, what is it going to take for us to change the perception about American education?
So this is what my research has really centered around. And I think in 2018, we saw the Red for Ed movement, and we saw teachers striking, especially in places we didn't expect teachers to strike, and some real focus on what teachers' working conditions were like. And so there was some coalescence around teachers and like, okay, we need to value these folks. And I think that continued into the pandemic. And in early March, it was like, oh, wow, teachers do a lot when things were first exposed. But I think we get worn down and we say, well, we all do a lot. And so I'm tired too. The teacher needs to do her job because I got to do my job. And I think that's problematic. And I think that's some of these calls, like teachers should be back in school, grocery workers are back in school or back at work. I think that we have to be careful of that thinking, because instead of that, we could say, yeah, we should be working for more protections for our grocery store workers too, instead of saying teachers are getting all these special privileges. And so I think we need to realize that we're all part of a community and that it takes all of us to make this work. And it's really hard in the midst of a pandemic when we're all burnt out and when we're all worn out. So I think there's potential there, but we're gonna have to rebuild and repair a lot of these relationships as well.
Yeah, and it's great to recognize the names for folks posing these questions too. And I would completely agree with that. And I think this is it's a collective bargaining argument. Honestly, it's about asking the question: what is our relationship to our labor? And if we're not contented with, and even if we are contented with the conditions in which we're working, again, it's about, and I mean, even just thinking about just before locally here in St. Paul, right? Just before the pandemic hit and schools closed, the St. Paul Teachers Union was on strike. Mm-hmm. And weirdly, the threat of this closure of the schools, I think, ended the strike a bit early.
It ended it preemptively.
Because it took away the power of the strike when they were like, well, schools are going to close anyway.
Right. If you're not back in the classrooms when the strike starts, you don't get paid.
Right.
When the pandemic starts and shut things down.
Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, the larger point though being that this is a labor issue, and it is an issue where we have to think about. Over the last 30 years, the deunionization not only of education and teaching, but broader deunionization. And so for in this case, thinking about what are the factors that have been leading to the deunionization of educators, and then also balancing that out, like you said, Lesley, with a lot of the strikes that happened in the last 4 years.
Well, and also, I think leaning into labor and this being a labor issue does not mean that it's just about teacher pay and working conditions. And so I think recognizing many of the other demands that teachers unions were making as they went on strike and as they went to state capitals over the last few years, they're asking for more counselors to support these mental health issues that are now crushing. Exactly. They're asking for more librarians. They are reaching out and including new groups of folks like their bus drivers or their teacher educators as a part of the same union, so they have more collective power. Here in St. Paul, the teachers union actually worked with the district and said, hey, district, we don't want you to work with Wells Fargo if you're going to foreclose on our students' families during the school year, and they're going to be kicked out of their homes. And so they're realizing that they have power, but they have more power when they work with and on behalf of the community. And so I don't want it to be, it's a labor issue, because I think that often we think about labor issues as being just about pay and working conditions, but teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions, and I think when we work together, we do best.
I also just think we've all been worn down by the pandemic, and so whatever kindness, appreciation, gratitude, and generosity people were feeling last March, not only toward teachers, but toward bus drivers and grocery workers and healthcare professionals. I mean, we're not banging pots and pans every night at 8 o'clock and doing rounds of applause. Why? We got tired. People have just been worn down, and so we're not our best selves right now. Right. And it's, I think, helpful for us to take stock and remember how much we do need to be appreciating all the folks who are putting themselves out on the front lines, teachers and everyone else who's doing that to make our communities work right now.
Right.
I think we have time for just a few more questions, and there's so many that I'm having a little bit of an issue trying to figure out which ones to ask. I am so sorry, everyone who's asked all these wonderful questions. So I think there's a question here. I'm going to paraphrase it slightly from Elena Santarella, class of 2019, about moving the finish line. basically. And if we move the finish line, how will students' social emotional growth be impacted by online school? But also like thinking President Rivera also as, you know, the head of Mcallister, you know, big deal. If we move the finish line in education, like K through 12, how does that then change?
Whoops. Well, I think I know where the question was going. Can I start answering it? Will they hear us? Okay. So how moving the line in K through 12 might affect college is a really important question. And it's one that Mcallister has already started grappling with. If all the alumni dialed in today do not know this, one of the things that prompted us to go test optional last year in our admissions process was an understanding that not just during the pandemic, but in general, testing as part of the admissions process does create an artificial barrier that prevents talented students from getting access to higher education. Not only because the tests are expensive, but it's unfair that some kids can afford expensive prep classes and other kids cannot. And in recognizing that, Mcallister and other schools that have gone test optional recognize that a more holistic approach to college admission processes is not only more fair, but actually gives us a better sense of who each applicant is. And so I think that making gestures like that to increase equity and access will be one of the silver linings of the way this pandemic has shined a light on structural inequality in ways that are sort of freeing us up to innovate.
I will say there's some historical precedent, though, with No Child Left Behind, which narrowed curricula. And I think colleagues that have been in my department longer than I have said that they really notice a change in the types of students that are coming following No Child Left Behind, because students used to be able to write better. They were asked to write, and they were asked to think in deeper ways. And in No Child Left Behind, when you focus narrowly and you aren't getting students to write, then they get to college and they don't have those skills. And we do have an opportunity and resources that a lot of public schools don't have in terms of just smaller class size and more individualized attention, so we can address those gaps. So if they make it here, we can do it. We have the resources. What I worry about is if you move that and they don't get to go on to college, that there are some things and some skills that they lack or some opportunities that they didn't have.
Yeah, and I also think it has to do with, and I think colleges and higher ed can do quite a lot of signaling to the kinds of students that we're looking for and who we're looking for. And again, knowing, with the history of standardized intelligence testing, this notion of the gap is kind of farcical because it's always been there, right? There was never this time where we didn't have a racialized class-based gap, right? And then it grew over time or something like that. It's always been there, and so signaling that metric is not as important to us in terms of thinking about who we want on this campus, but then I think it's up to us then to say, okay, then who do we want, and then how will that push K-12 schools to then say, okay, these are the kinds of students that we want to create, that will have the opportunity to go to places like Mcallister or any, right, like any institution.
Yep.
And the more we kind of make education, I think the more we make education a scarce resource, the more we look at, education as a commodity that allows entry into, right, a higher social class, right? I think we're kind of in a lot of ways working against history to be able to name and say, okay, how do we actually have this conversation in a different way, and who do we want to be on this campus, and all campuses? Yep.
I'm so sorry, y'all. Zoom problems are so fun. They're so fun. So I think I love a hopeful question. It's the English teacher in me. So this question is from Emily P.G. Erickson, class 2008, she, hers. So far, are you seeing any evidence of the pandemic working to make education more equitable? My fear is that if this doesn't inspire us to invest in and improve public education, nothing will. So is there any evidence that we're becoming more equitable?
I think it's too soon to tell. I'm not particularly hopeful. Like I said at the beginning, I'm worried about the future of public schools. And we saw students go to private schools when public schools didn't open. Are they coming back? And are they worried about what happened to their institutions? Are state governments and is the federal government going to really step up in the way that we need to repair from the trauma? I'm not sure. I am usually optimistic and I love to be hopeful, but I think in most ways this has exacerbated inequities and exposed them. If the exposure makes us wake up, great, but I don't know if we're going to be awake long enough to address it or at the right time to address it.
I think the hope that I see is in it's in an educational revolt. Honestly, I think we're seeing a lot of people. I'm hesitant to say like more than normal. Be really dissatisfied, and I think that potentially we are, I think we have the ingredients for an educational revolution that can spark quite a dramatic change in how the country experiences education. That being said, there's also a really large and really powerful set of voices and decision makers who are already calling for things like the measurement of learning loss, the continued technicization of education into bits of knowledge,
more vouchers,
more labor, or more kind of like expectations of teachers without additional resources. And so, there's going to be, it's education's always contested. And so, I think there's hope in the spirit that there will be a large kind of like mass movement towards something different.
President Rivera, I'm going to give you the last question.
Great, thanks, Celeste. I'm actually going to push you a little bit. Celeste just asked a question about hope, and neither one of you wanted to offer us much, so I'm going to push a little harder. And I'm going to pose it in a different way and say, from where I sit, there's been an incredible amount of innovation, creativity, ingenuity applied not only in the K-12 system, but also in higher education. We've seen it here among our own faculty and staff, who were able to accomplish, feats of transformation in a short amount of time about things that for years and years people said we were not capable of doing. So when you look back on what we've learned in the last 9 months, if you can't give us hope, can you at least name a few examples of things you might consider silver linings, things we've learned to do, things we've improved, things we've advanced because of the pandemic?
Well, I think to change something, you do have to understand it and to name it. And so we are understanding disadvantages in a different way when we see them and when we see the many facets that go into making disadvantage, into compounding disadvantage. I also think we're going to have new conversations about mental health, which I think is a really good thing. We're recognizing the demands on folks and that sometimes those demands are unsustainable or unrealistic. And I'm talking with my students at Mcallister all the time about this, and I know this is happening in my children's elementary school, and I think that's a great development. And that if we see people as whole people, that maybe we empower them to do some of the change work that Brian's alluded to.
Yeah, and I think the hopefulness that I see is the expansion that would happen in a return to some more, and you see the blended learning, and so being able to say, okay, what does this mean to have more flexibility and dexterity from teachers and students in terms of how we engage in like multimedia environments. And so, but again, I think it comes down to creating high quality, a lot of times inquiry-based learning environments where people can be asking deep and engaging fundamental questions, and then having so many avenues to be able to engage with that, I think is exciting.
Can I say one more thing? I don't think people are taking education for granted, right? Our students that came back here at Mcallister are like, yeah, Zoom's not great, but it's better than the alternative. And I know that my kids were thinking that too, and that then they just went back to school and they are so happy. I'm sure the middle schooler will go to middle school and decide that it's not the greatest thing ever, but right now it's the greatest thing ever. And I think that that's really important for the students in addition to the adults that are making decisions.
Yeah, and I'm going to just sort of take the host's prerogative here and add one more thing that I see, and that is that in acquiring a lot of these new tools, it seems to me that we're doing a lot better when it comes to accessibility. I mean, I see the way that students are able to take advantage of things like closed captioning or being able to rewatch a lecture or slow down the pace of a lecture. For people who had difficulty under what we call the old normal, I hope that we can retain some of these tools so that when we go into something that is a more familiar looking classroom setting, that we don't forget everything we learned about how to make teaching more inclusive and more accessible.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I'd love to keep having this conversation, but I know that people are waiting to do the socializing part of the evening. So first, let me just give a really sincere thank you, both to Professor Lavery and Professor Lozenski, because this conversation was great, and Celeste Prince for your hosting of the Q&A portion. We appreciate that. I also want to thank all of the people in the audience for the thoughtful questions they posed through the Q&A chat. This pandemic has brought so much despair, so much loss, so much grief. But I do have a sense of hope that we're learning how to be better. I hope that Mcallister people living this college's values will take everything they have learned to go out and make our education system more just and more equitable, which in turn will help all of us flourish. So with that, before we move to the networking portion of the event, I'm really honored to introduce Justin Brandon, who's from the class of 2000. Justin is the incoming president of our alumni board. He's a class agent and head of upper school at Francis W. Parker School, and he's going to share his Mcallister story with us tonight. After Justin's words, I'm looking forward to networking with you during the final portion of our event in the Zoom breakout rooms. And so now I would like to introduce Justin Brandon, class of 2000. Justin, are you ready?
I am ready. President Rivera, thank you so much for that great introduction. You actually took a couple of minutes off of my time, which is perfect. As a high school principal, there are a couple of thoughts I want to share with this timely conversation. And many of these topics that were discussed tonight are conversations we're having in our high school environment here in Chicago. One of the questions is, what have we learned about schools, our students, families, and ourselves during this pandemic? How can we celebrate the small victories and the hope that President Rivera was alluding to? What should we take with us as we begin to return to schools on a more consistent basis in the next year and beyond? And how can we redefine the portrait of a high school graduate? And I'd love for us to continue this conversation of how we can now elevate mental health, empathy, and social emotional learning during this pandemic in schools. And I'd also probably say at homes too. A lot of the points shared tonight really talked about this social emotional learning aspect of schools that was really kind of othered in so many ways before the pandemic that has now come to the forefront, rightfully so. And I hope we can continue that conversation. As we kind of transition, I wanted to share a little bit about my Mcallister experience here and how this conversation reminded me of the why and when I would become an educator. The why and when all starts at Mac. I tutored underserved students every week during my time at Mac. I would go to Minneapolis and get on in a Mac van with other Mac classmates, and we would go tutor every Tuesday night. I loved making the connections and opening doors with those students and sharing the experiences with my Mac classmates who joined me every week. And we'd go back in the van and ride back Tuesday evening and just kind of really think about, the connections and the difference and just moving beyond campus. That opportunity helped me understand that the Mac community is more than a classroom. It's about experiential learning and experiential leading. That is the real Mcallister experience. And I'd like to continue by saying the leadership we need for our future is inspired at Mcallister. Driving to discover, viewing the world through an equitable and global lens, questioning the status quo, and offering new solutions to build a stronger world. Investing in the Mcallister Fund is investing in hope. The Mcallister Fund provides critical funding that supports every student every day. It's the primary way that we build a strong and steady base of financial support for the future of Mcallister, especially now. The following are Mcallister Fund key messages you can weave in as you'd like. Financial burdens on many students and their families have increased due to the pandemic. In this challenging landscape, your gift to the Mcallister Fund can provide immediate assistance. Mcallister remains committed to meeting the full financial need of every student we admit. I need to repeat that. Mcallister remains committed to meeting the full financial need of every student we admit. We also remain committed to helping students experiencing unanticipated financial hardships through our emergency aid program. Making a gift to the Mcallister Fund is a declaration that you believe in Mcallister students and in the future. The twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racial justice have magnified just how much we need Mcallister students now. They aren't just thinkers, they are doers. A Mcallister education equips students with a multifaceted 21st century skilled educational experience to tackle complex problems at home and abroad. The Mcallister Fund now offers a number of designations so that you can target your investment in areas that matter most to you. Please invest in hope for all Mcallister students. We realize that not everyone can make a major gift, but everyone can make their best gift. Watch for a follow-up email from tonight's event with ways you can get engaged with Mcallister. Virtual events with college updates, opportunity to connect with faculty, inspiration through alumni stories, professional development, and more. Always check the MAC Together webpage for events and ways to stay connected. We hope this brings comfort and inspiration to you as it connects our alumni community. Mcallister is always at its best when we take things on together. I'll say that again. Mcallister is always at its best when we take things on together. Also, in the MAC Wire that came out today, we hope you saw the notice about the launching of the MAC Direct. Please go in and create a new login. I did it myself. It took about 5 minutes, so it doesn't take much time. And now we close today's big question event with a Mcallister tradition, the offering of the peace prayer by our current students. This tradition is a beautiful illustration of the values we hold dear.
เมื่อเฮาเริ่มออกเดินทางไปคนละสายขอให้พวกเฮาถูกหล่อเลี้ยงด้วยมิตรภาพและการเรียนรู้ที่แสนยาวนานขอให้เฮาใช้สิ่งเหล่านั้นสร้างโลกที่มีความยุติธรรมและสงบสุขยิ่งขึ้นโลกที่เต็มไปด้วยมิตรสหายและญาติพี่น้องความเคารพและเมตตาซึ่งกันและกันและความหวังเพื่ออนาคตที่ดีกว่าเก่า
अब हामी आफ्नो जिन्दगीको नयाँ यात्रामा अघि बढ्दा हाम्रो वर्षौंदेखिको मित्रता र शिक्षाबाट हामी सिन्चित हुन सकौं र यसलाई आधार बनाई अझै न्यायपूर्ण र शान्तिमय सद्भाव र सम्बन्धले गाँसिएको र एक अर्काप्रति आदर र करुणा गर्ने उज्जवल भविष्यको संसार सृजना गर्न सकौं
As we depart along our separate roads, may we be nourished by our years of friendship and learning, and may we draw upon them to create a more just and peaceful world, a world filled with fellowship and kinship, with respect and kindness for one another, and with the hope of a better tomorrow.
Thank you again for joining this evening. We hope you will continue the conversation and networking in our Zoom room. Follow the link posted in the chat or from your confirmation email to join the Zoom networking meeting room. We will have breakout rooms to allow participants to meet in smaller groups and with our speakers. Once you join, you will be able to choose the breakout room of your choice. Please remember to turn your camera and mic on. The rooms will remain open until 8:45 p.m.